In 1945, the Second World War burned itself out in fire and ash. Nations celebrated, cities rebuilt, the world exhaled. But deep in the tangled jungles of the Pacific, the war did not end. Not for everyone. Across remote islands, thousands of miles from Tokyo, small groups of Imperial Japanese soldiers kept fighting, years after Japan surrendered. Some for a decade, some for 2, one for almost 30 years. These men came to be known as the Japanese holdouts, ghost soldiers who lived in a world frozen in time, where loyalty outweighed logic and surrender was unthinkable. This is their story. To understand how anyone could continue fighting a war long after it ended, one must understand the mindset of the Imperial Japanese Army. From the 1930s onward, soldiers were conditioned under a military doctrine rooted in 2 powerful ideas. Bushido, the way of the warrior, which taught absolute loyalty, discipline, and honor. And Jokusai, the belief that death in battle was preferable to the shame of surrender. Japanese soldiers were repeatedly told, "Never lay down your arms. Fight until death." Surrender was not simply forbidden, it was unimaginable. So when communications broke down in the final months of World War II and scattered units found themselves cut off, many assumed the silence meant only one thing. Japan was still fighting, and so must they. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, his voice crackled through battered radio receivers across the empire. But on dozens of remote Pacific islands, surviving Japanese soldiers had no radios, no officers, no orders. For them, nothing changed. To these men, the sudden quiet in the jungle was not peace, it was a trap. Allied forces dropped leaflets, thousands of them, proclaiming the war over. But many holdouts refused to believe it. Some thought the leaflets were enemy propaganda. Some believed Japan would never surrender, no matter the cost. Some thought the empire had launched a secret counterattack. And some, like the most famous holdout, Hiroo Onoda, had been given specific orders. Never surrender. Never take your own life. Keep fighting until your commanding officer returns. Their loyalty was iron, and their isolation absolute. In the early years after the war, small groups of holdouts were discovered across the former Japanese perimeter. On Guam, a trio of soldiers was discovered in 1945, still armed, still hiding in caves, convinced the American invasion was only the beginning. On Mindanao, the Philippines, pockets of resistance continued sporadic attacks until 1950. Yes, 1950, 5 years after the war. On Wake Island, 2 Japanese soldiers shot at U.S. servicemen in 1945, unaware the war had ended the month before. One by one, these men were found, thin, sick, but still loyal to an empire that no longer existed. But the most incredible stories were still ahead. In January 1972, nearly 3 decades after World War II, 2 hunters on the island of Guam stumbled upon a man in worn clothing made entirely of hand-woven fibers. His beard was long, his body thin, his eyes cautious, alert, wild. His name was Shoichi Yokoi, a former sergeant who had been hiding since 1944. For 28 years, he lived entirely off the land, fishing, trapping eels, foraging nuts and berries. He crafted clothes from tree bark, fashioned tools from bamboo, and built underground shelters camouflaged so perfectly they were almost invisible. When Yokoi was captured, He bowed his head and told his rescuers a sentence that echoed around the world. "It is with much embarrassment that I return." Embarrassment, not relief, because in his mind, surviving instead of dying in battle brought shame. Back in Japan, millions greeted him with awe. He became a symbol of loyalty and endurance. But inside, Yokoi carried decades of solitude, nearly half his life spent in a war that no longer existed. He was not the last. On the Philippine island of Lubang, a small group of Japanese soldiers refused to believe the war was over. Led by three men, Onoda Hiroo, Kozuka Kinshichi, and Akatsu Yuichi, the unit continued guerrilla operations long after the last Japanese troops had surrendered. In 1949, Akatsu, exhausted and starving, slipped away from the group and surrendered to Philippine forces. When he returned to Japan, he begged officials to convince the others to surrender. Leaflets were dropped, letters from family, even messages from former commanders. But Onoda and Kozuka dismissed everything as enemy trickery. They believed Japan was preparing a counteroffensive. They believed the empire would return. And so they fought on, burning rice fields, raiding villages, engaging in firefights with local police. Kozuka was killed in 1972 during one such clash, 27 years after the war. Only one man remained. The most legendary holdout of them all. Hiroo Onoda was a trained intelligence officer. Before being deployed to Lubang in 1944, he had been given explicit orders by his superior officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. "You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. You must continue fighting. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but no matter what happens, we will return for you." For Onoda, these words became sacred. When Japan surrendered in 1945, no one returned to Lubang. To Onoda, that meant the mission was still active. Over the next 29 years, he and his companions fought an invisible war. They stole food, gathered intelligence, and stayed hidden in the mountains. They read leaflets about the surrender, but believed they were fakes. They saw newspapers, but assumed they were clever forgeries. Even after losing partners, even after countless search parties, Onoda persisted. His war continued through. The rise and fall of post-war Japan, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the moon landing, the Cold War, and even Japan hosting the Olympics. Time moved on. But for Onoda, the calendar remained frozen in 1945. In 1974, a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki left for the Philippines on a curious personal quest. He declared, "I will find Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman." To everyone's shock, the first part came true. Suzuki trekked deep into the jungles of Lubang, calling out in Japanese, "Onoda-san, I am Japanese. The war is over." Against all odds, Onoda appeared, skeptical, armed, cautious. He spoke with Suzuki for hours, and for the first time in decades, he began to doubt his mission. Not enough to surrender, but enough to ask one thing: "Bring me my commanding officer," the only man he would obey. Weeks later, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, now long retired, returned to Lubang Island at the request of the Japanese government. He called out into the foliage. And like a ghost from the past, Hiroo Onoda stepped forward, wearing a patched uniform and carrying his rifle, still well-maintained, still ready for war. Taniguchi read the orders. All combat operations are ceased. Onoda, you are relieved from duty." Onoda saluted. He lowered his rifle. And only then, 29 years after the war, did he surrender. His equipment, still functional, stunned the world. A rifle in perfect condition, 500 rounds of ammunition, grenades, a dagger his mother had given him in 1944. His first words after surrendering? "I only regret that I could not serve the Emperor to my full potential." Onoda's surrender made headlines worldwide, but he was not the final holdout. Later that same year, another soldier was discovered on the island of Moritai, Private Teruo Nakamura, a Taiwanese-born member of the Japanese Army. Nakamura had lived alone for decades in a small hut he built himself. When Indonesian forces located him in December 1974, he offered no resistance. Unlike Onoda, Nakamura became the forgotten holdout, famous briefly, then fading into obscurity, in part because he wasn't ethnically Japanese. He returned to Taiwan quietly. He died in 1979. His war had lasted 30 years. By the late 1970s, the era of Japanese holdouts had finally come to a close. In total, dozens were discovered between 1945 and 1974 across the Pacific, on Guam, Saipan, Luzon, Peleliu, Moritai, and other islands. Some surrendered peacefully. Some fought until the end. Some were never found. For Japan, the holdouts became symbols of a bygone era, part heroism, part tragedy, part cautionary tale about loyalty taken to impossible extremes. For historians, they represent the ultimate consequence of a military doctrine built on unquestioning obedience and absolute refusal to surrender. And for the world, they remain unforgettable reminders that wars do not end cleanly, not in the minds of those sworn to fight them. For the Japanese holdouts, surrender was not merely the end of a mission, it was the collapse of an entire worldview. When they finally emerged from the jungle, blinking in the sunlight of a world they no longer recognized, many found themselves strangers in their own homeland. Japan had transformed beyond anything they could imagine. The militaristic empire they fought for was gone, replaced by a democratic nation rebuilt on peace, industry, and technology. Neon skylines glowed over cities they once knew as bombed ruins. Bullet trains crisscrossed a nation that had once relied on steam. Western culture, fashion, music, all had woven themselves into Japanese daily life. To the returning holdouts, this was not just the future, it was another planet. Some, like Shoichi Yokoi, struggled with this cultural whiplash. He had lived for nearly 3 decades without electricity, money, or modern conveniences. When he returned to Tokyo, he marveled at escalators, televisions, and supermarkets, but privately confessed that the new Japan felt alien. Others, like Onoda, faced even deeper internal conflict. For them, loyalty had been a defining principle, a compass that guided their entire existence. To suddenly learn that the war ended decades ago, that comrades had surrendered, that their empire had fallen, shattered the foundation of their identity. Psychologists later described the phenomenon as a kind of temporal dislocation, a tearing of the self between 2 eras, the past roaring into the present without warning. Yet, despite the shock, each holdout adapted in their own way. Yokoi became a television personality for a time, sharing his survival techniques with curious audiences. Onoda wrote memoirs, opened a nature school for youth, and eventually settled into a quieter life abroad. Nakamura, however, returned to Taiwan with little fanfare, slipping back into the margins of history. a reminder that not all holdouts were celebrated equally. Their stories also forced Japan to confront uncomfortable questions about the military system that produced such unwavering obedience. Historians and sociologists debated whether the holdouts were heroes, victims, or relics of a dangerous ideology. But regardless of interpretation, their endurance captured global imagination. The idea that a soldier could remain hidden for 30 years, surviving alone on instinct, discipline, and belief, became one of the most astonishing human stories of the 20th century. And in the decades that followed, every rediscovered holdout served as a poignant reminder that war leaves long shadows, ones that stretch far beyond treaties, armistices, and official endings. Because for those trapped in its echo, the last battle is never simply the one fought on the field. Sometimes it is the moment they finally lay down their fear and step into the world again. Today, the story of the Japanese holdouts raises difficult questions. What is loyalty worth? When does duty become delusion? How far can a human mind go when anchored to a mission that no longer exists? For men like Yokoi, Onoda, and Nakamura, the answer was simple. A soldier must follow orders, no matter the cost. But history looks deeper. These men were not superhuman warriors. They were products of their time, shaped by an empire that demanded everything, even decades after its fall. Their endurance is astonishing, their loyalty undeniable, their tragedy profound. Each holdout was a man trapped between worlds, between past and present, war and peace, honor and futility. They survived because they believed. They fought because they trusted. They held out because surrender was never an option. In the silence of forgotten jungles, the last echoes of a vanished empire finally faded in the 1970s. But the stories of the Japanese holdouts endure, etched into history as some of the strangest, most haunting chapters of the Second World War. For while nations can sign treaties and generals can declare peace, the human mind does not surrender so easily. Some wars end with the stroke of a pen, others only when the last soldier comes home.